The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the ammunition factory as Sarah Mitchell's calloused hands moved with mechanical precision. Box after box of .50 caliber rounds passed through her station, each one destined for military operations she would never see. It was honest work, quiet work, exactly what she needed after everything that had happened. But on this particular Tuesday morning in December, as snow began falling outside the windows of the Remington facility in Ohio, a visitor would walk through those factory doors who would recognize something about Sarah that she'd spent 3 years trying to hide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 6-shift horn echoed through the cavernous factory floor, and Sarah Mitchell was already at her station. She'd been coming in early for months now, finding comfort in the solitude before the day shift arrived. The repetitive motion of packing ammunition into shipping containers had become a meditation of sorts, a way to quiet the noise that still sometimes filled her head during the sleepless hours. Sarah's supervisor, Dale Harrison, barely looked up anymore when he made his rounds. She was his most reliable worker, never missed a day, never complained, and her error rate was practically zero. What Dale didn't know, what nobody at the Remington plant knew, was that Sarah had handled these same rounds in very different circumstances not so long ago. The morning progressed like any other. Workers filtered in, coffee was brewing in the break room, and the steady rhythm of the production line began its daily symphony. Sarah kept her head down, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same faded jeans and steel-toed boots that had become her uniform. The long sleeves of her flannel shirt covered the intricate tattoos that snaked up both arms, tattoos that told a story she wasn't ready to share with her coworkers. Around 10:30, Dale appeared at her station with a clipboard and a man sheet never seen before. The stranger was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of posture that immediately suggested military background. His civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a black jacket couldn't quite hide the way he carried himself. There was something in his eyes, a sharpness that Sarah recognized but hoped he wouldn't see reflected in her own. "Sarah, this is Commander Jake Reynolds," Dale said, using the formal tone he reserved for company visitors. "He's here from the Department of Defense, doing some routine quality inspections on our military contracts." Sarah nodded politely, continuing her work. She'd dealt with military inspectors before during her time at the plant. They usually asked standard questions about procedures and moved on. But something about this one felt different. He wasn't looking at the ammunition or checking production specifications. He was looking at her. "Ma'am," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command. "Mind if I ask how long you've been working at this particular station?" "About 8 months," Sarah replied, not looking up from the container she was packing. "Started here in April." Reynolds picked up one of the finished boxes, examining the labeling with what appeared to be professional interest. But Sarah caught him glancing at her hands, watching the way she handled the ammunition with an efficiency that spoke of something more than factory training. "You pack these pretty fast," he observed. "Almost like you've worked with this type of ordnance before." The comment hung in the air for a moment. Sarah's hands never paused in their work, but something shifted in the atmosphere around her station. Dale, oblivious to the undercurrent, launched into an explanation of Sarah's excellent performance metrics and reliability record. Reynolds continued his inspection, asking technical questions about storage procedures and shipping protocols. But Sarah could feel his attention returning to her repeatedly. When she reached for a new box of ammunition, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing just the edge of what looked like a military insignia tattooed on her forearm. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Reynolds' eyes sharpened with recognition, though he said nothing. He finished his questions with Dale and moved on to the next station, But Sarah knew he'd be back. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in her truck in the parking lot, trying to shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was about to unravel. She'd chosen this job specifically because it was under the radar, a place where someone like her could blend in, earn an honest living, and avoid the questions that came with her past. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills for her small apartment across town, and more importantly, nobody asked about where she'd been or what she'd done before arriving in Ohio. She'd grown up in Montana, daughter of a rancher who taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bike. Military service had seemed like a natural progression, a way to see the world and serve her country. What she hadn't expected was how good she'd be at the darker aspects of that service, or how hard it would be to come home when it was all over. The tattoos on her arms weren't just decorative. Each symbol, each mark told a story of missions completed, objectives achieved, and prices paid. The small tally marks on her left shoulder, barely visible beneath her sleeve, represented something she'd never spoken about to anyone, not to the military psychiatrists, not to the VIA counselors, not even to herself in the quiet moments when the memories threatened to surface. When she returned from lunch, Reynolds was waiting by her station. Dale was nowhere to be seen, and the other workers seemed to be giving them space. Whether by coincidence or design, Sarah couldn't tell. "Sarah Mitchell," Reynolds said, and the way he said her name made it clear this wasn't a casual conversation anymore. "I did some checking during lunch. Your employment records here show you as having no prior military experience." Sarah continued packing ammunition, her movements steady despite the racing of her pulse. "That's correct." "Interesting thing about employment records," Reynolds continued, moving closer. "Sometimes they don't tell the whole story. Sometimes people have reasons for leaving certain details out of their background checks." She finally looked up at him, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. In that moment, she saw recognition there, not just of what he suspected, but of something deeper. He knew. Somehow, this Navy SEAL commander had seen through 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity. "I don't know what you think you know," Sarah said quietly, "but I'm just here to do my job." Reynolds nodded slowly, his expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to respect. "I'm sure you are. But the way you handle those rounds, the tattoos I can see peeking out from your sleeves, and most importantly, the fact that you recognized me as military the moment I walked up, that tells a different story." The conversation was interrupted by Dale's return, clipboard in hand and completely unaware of the tension that had developed in his absence. Reynolds smoothly shifted back into his official inspector role, asking a few more procedural questions. Before preparing to leave Dot as he walked away, he paused and turned back to Sarah. "Mitchell," he said, loud enough for Dale to hear, but with an undertone meant only for her. "If you ever want to talk about proper ammunition handling techniques, I'll be at the Holiday Inn on Route 30 through Thursday. Room 247. After Reynolds left, Sarah tried to return to her normal routine, but her hands were shaking slightly as she worked. 3 years of peace, 3 years of anonymity, and now someone from her old world had found her. The question wasn't whether he knew, it was what he planned to do about it. As her shift ended, and she walked to her truck through the falling snow, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life in Ohio was about to become much more complicated. The scars on her shoulder seemed to burn beneath her shirt, reminding her of choices made in places far from this peaceful factory town. Choices that had earned her recognition she'd never wanted and a reputation she'd tried desperately to leave behind. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at a business card she'd found tucked under her windshield wiper. Commander Jake Reynolds, Naval Special Warfare Command, with a handwritten note on the back. "Coffee tomorrow? 7 a.m., Murphy's Diner on Main Street." Her one-bedroom apartment reflected the minimalist lifestyle she'd adopted since arriving in Ohio. Basic furniture, no photographs on the walls, nothing that spoke to a past she'd worked so hard to bury. The only personal items were a worn leather jacket hanging by the door and a locked metal box hidden in her bedroom closet, contents she hadn't touched in over a year. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the mountains of Afghanistan, the weight of her rifle familiar in her hands, the sound of her spotter's voice in her earpiece. Marcus Chen had been her partner for 18 months, covering each other through missions that existed only in classified files. The last time she'd seen him, he was bleeding out in a dusty village while she provided covering fire for the extraction. Teamed up by 6:45 the next morning, Sarah was parked outside Murphy's Diner, watching through the frost-covered window as Reynolds sat alone in a corner booth. He'd traded his inspection clothes for jeans and a flannel shirt, but even in civilian attire, he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. The diner was exactly the kind of place Sarah had grown comfortable with, a working-class establishment where conversation stayed quiet and people minded their own business. The morning regulars were already settled at the counter, discussing weather and local politics over coffee and eggs. Reynolds stood when she approached his table, a gesture of respect that immediately put Sarah on edge. In her experience, when military officers showed that kind of courtesy to someone they just met, it usually meant they knew more about that person than they were letting on. "Appreciate you coming," Reynolds said as she slid into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here," Sarah replied, ordering black coffee from the waitress who appeared with practiced efficiency. "Doesn't mean I'm talking." Reynolds smiled, the kind of expression that suggested he'd been in similar situations before. "Fair enough, let me start then." He pulled out a tablet, swiped to a document, and placed it face down on the table between them. 3 years ago, Operation Desert Storm was compromised in the Helmand province. Taliban forces had intelligence on our forward operating base that should have been impossible for them to obtain. Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Operation Desert Storm wasn't something that appeared in news reports or military press releases. It was buried so deep in classified files that even mentioning the name in public should have been impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 17 American servicemen died in that ambush, Reynolds continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Would have been a complete massacre if not for overwatch provided by a 2-person sniper team positioned on the ridge overlooking the valley. The diner seemed to fade around them. Sarah could hear the distant sound of helicopters, feel the desert. Wind against her face, smell the cordite and dust that had become as familiar as breathing during her deployment. According to the after-action reports, Reynolds said, that sniper team held off an entire Taliban company for 6 hours, allowing enough time for reinforcements to arrive and extract the survivors. Longest confirmed engagement in modern warfare. History. He flipped the tablet over, revealing a satellite image of a mountainous region Sarah recognized immediately. Red markers indicated enemy positions, blue markers showed friendly forces, and a single green marker showed the sniper position, where she'd spent the longest 6 hours of her life. Official records show the sniper team as Sergeant Marcus Chien and an unidentified spotter, Reynolds continued. Chun received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His partner disappeared from official records entirely, medical discharge for undisclosed reasons, and nothing. Sarah set her coffee cup down carefully, her hand steadier than she felt. Interesting story. Not sure why you're telling it to someone who packs ammunition for a living. Reynolds reached across the table and gently pushed up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing the edge of a tattoo that showed a mountain range with coordinates beneath it. Because those are the exact coordinates of Ridge 2847, where that sniper team made their stand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the diner, Conversations, clinking silverware, the hiss of the coffee machine seemed amplified in the silence between them. "You don't know what you're talking about," Sarah finally said, pulling her sleeve back down. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," Reynolds said quietly. "Born Billings, Montana, 1991. Father William Mitchell, cattle rancher. Mother died in a car accident when you were 12. Enlisted Army at 18, scored perfect on marksmanship tests, selected for specialized training. Deployed to Afghanistan. 2018 with the 75th Ranger Regiment." Each fact hit like a physical blow. Sarah had spent 3 years believing her old identity was buried, that the person she'd been in Afghanistan was safely locked away in classified files that would never see daylight. "After the Helmand incident," Reynolds continued, "you spent 8 months in Walter Reed Medical Center. Doctors said you were suffering from severe PTSD, recommended early discharge. You refused to attend debriefing sessions, wouldn't talk to military psychiatrists, and specifically requested that your service record be classified at the highest levels." Sarah stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing several other diners to look their way. "I need to go. Sit down, Mitchell." The command in Reynolds' voice was unmistakable. "We're not done here." Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself settling back into the booth. Years of military conditioning were hard to break, even in an Ohio diner far from any battlefield. Reynolds leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here because my country needs you." "Your country?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Your country threw me away when I became inconvenient. Gave me a medical discharge and a pension, told me to disappear and stay quiet about what I'd seen over there." "What you did in Afghanistan saved lives," Reynolds said firmly. "The intelligence community has been tracking your activities since you left the service. The apartment in Denver where you stayed for 6 months, the job at the gun range in Colorado Springs, that brief stint working security in Kansas City before you ended up here." The revelation that her movements had been monitored sent a chill through Sarah. She'd thought she was invisible, just another veteran trying to find a place in civilian life. Instead, she'd been watched, tracked, cataloged like an asset that might someday prove useful again. "Every job you've taken has been connected to weapons or military equipment," Reynolds observed. "Almost like you can't quite leave it behind completely." "I'm done with that life," Sarah said. Though even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice, Reynolds slid a manila folder across the table. 6 months ago, a weapons shipment bound for our allies in Eastern Europe was intercepted by unknown forces. 200 advanced sniper rifles, along with specialized ammunition and targeting equipment. The kind of hardware that could tip the balance in several ongoing conflicts. Despite herself, Sarah found her attention drawn to the folder. The tactical part of her mind, the part she'd been trying to suppress for 3 years, was already wondering about logistics, security protocols, and how such an operation could have been carried out. 3 weeks later, Reynolds continued, intelligence agencies identified the weapons being used by terrorist cells in Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. American-made rifles in the hands of people who are using them to target American interests. Sarah opened the folder, revealing photographs of the stolen weapons and satellite imagery of their suspected locations. Her trained eye immediately began analyzing the tactical situation shown in the images. The theft was an inside job, Reynolds said. Someone with detailed knowledge of military transport protocols, shipping schedules, and security procedures. Someone with the skills to coordinate a complex operation across multiple countries. A new photograph appeared on the table, a grainy surveillance image showing a figure in tactical gear directing the loading of crates onto a truck. The image was too unclear to make out facial features, but something about the person's posture and movement struck Sarah as familiar. Our analysts believe this operation was planned and executed by someone with advanced military training. Someone with intimate knowledge of special operations procedures. Reynolds paused, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. Someone like Marcus Chun. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus Chun, her spotter, her partner, the man she'd watched die in the mountains of Afghanistan. She could still remember the weight of his body as she'd tried to drag him to cover, the sound of his voice growing weaker as he called out target adjustments during those final hours. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "Marcus died in that village. I was there. I held him while he bled out." Reynolds pulled out another photograph, a more recent surveillance image, showing a man's profile as he entered a building in Eastern Europe. The facial features were partially obscured by shadows and tactical gear, but there was something about the jawline, the way he carried himself, that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Facial recognition software suggests a 73% probability match," Reynolds said quietly. "But there's only one person alive who knows Marcus Chen well enough to confirm or deny his identity with certainty." The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. If Marcus was alive, if he'd somehow survived that day in Afghanistan and had spent the past 3 years letting her believe he was dead, then everything she thought she knew about that mission, about his sacrifice, about her own guilt and grief, was a lie. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would he fake his death? Why would he steal those weapons?" "That's what we need to find out," Reynolds replied. "And you're the only person who might be able to get close enough to him to learn the truth." Sarah stared at the photographs, spread across the table, her mind reeling with possibilities and implications. The quiet life she'd built in Ohio suddenly seemed as fragile as a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. "You want me to hunt down my former partner," she said slowly, "the man I thought was dead." "I want you to find the truth," Reynolds corrected. "Whether that man is Marcus Chen or someone using his identity, he's a threat to American interests and allied forces around the world. Those stolen weapons are being used to kill innocent people." Outside the diner window, snow had begun falling. Again, coating the small Ohio town in a blanket of white that seemed to muffle all sound. Sarah watched the flakes drift past the glass, each one unique and ephemeral, like the moments that had led her to this conversation. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Reynolds gathered the photographs and documents, sliding them back into the folder. "Then you go back to your apartment, show up for your shift tomorrow morning, and continue packing ammunition for the rest of your life. But those weapons will still be out there, still being used to kill people, and you'll spend every day knowing you had a chance to stop it." He stood and placed a $20 bill on the table to cover their coffee. "Take the night to think about it. I'll be at the hotel until tomorrow evening." As Reynolds walked away, Sarah remained in the booth, staring at the folder he'd left behind. Inside were surveillance photographs, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments that painted a picture of a ghost from her past who might not be as dead as she'd believed. The waitress returned to refill her coffee cup, chatting briefly about the weather before moving on to other customers. Around her, the normal rhythms of small-town life continued, oblivious to the storm that was brewing in Sarah's mind. She opened the folder again, studying the unclear surveillance image that might or might not show Marcus Chen. 3 years ago, she'd made a promise at his graveside to honor his sacrifice by living the peaceful life he'd died to protect. Now she was being asked to break that promise, to return to a world of violence and shadows she'd fought so hard to escape. But if Marcus was alive, if he'd somehow survived and chosen to let her believe otherwise, then perhaps that promise had been built on a foundation of lies. And if those stolen weapons were being used to harm innocent people, then her peaceful life in Ohio was being purchased with the blood of others. Sarah finished her coffee and walked out into the falling snow, the folder tucked under her arm and a decision weighing heavy on her heart. Sarah's apartment felt different when she returned that afternoon. The sparse furniture and bare walls that had once represented freedom from her past now seemed like a prison she'd built for herself. She set the classified folder on her kitchen table and opened a beer, her first drink in over 6 months. The photograph stared back at her, surveillance images of weapons caches, tactical diagrams of the theft operation, and that haunting profile shot that might or might not be Marcus Chun. She traced her finger along the edge of the image, remembering the scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from an IED blast during their second deployment. Together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dale. "Hope you're feeling better. Take tomorrow off if you need to." She'd called in sick after the meeting with Reynolds, the first day she'd missed work since starting at the ammunition plant. The lie came easier than she'd expected, but then again, she wasn't entirely sure it was a lie. Something inside her felt broken, fractured by the possibility that the man she'd mourned for 3 years might have been living a different life entirely. The metal box in her bedroom closet seemed to call to her as evening approached. She'd avoided opening it since moving to Ohio, treating it like Pandora's box, something that should remain sealed to prevent unleashing forces she couldn't control. But tonight, with classified documents spread across her table and ghosts from Afghanistan demanding answers, the temptation was overwhelming. Inside the box were the remnants of her military service that she couldn't quite throw away. Her sniper's logbook, filled with range cards and environmental calculations, written in her careful handwriting. A folded American flag that had draped Marcus's coffin during the memorial service she'd attended via satellite link from her hospital bed. Letters of commendation that praised her accuracy and dedication, while carefully omitting the details that would reveal the true nature of her service. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was her personal sidearm, a modified 1911 pistol that had been her constant companion through 18 months of combat operations. She'd managed to purchase it from the military when she was discharged, one of the few pieces of her old life she'd been unable to abandon completely. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, the weight and balance as natural as breathing. Muscle memory kicked in as she performed an automatic functions check, her fingers moving through the routine without conscious thought. The pistol was unloaded, its ammunition locked in a separate container as required by law, but holding it again brought back a flood of memories she'd worked hard to suppress. Her phone rang at 9:30, an unknown number that she almost ignored. But something made her answer on the 4th ring, and Reynolds' voice filled the quiet apartment. "I know you're still deciding," he said without preamble, "but there's something else you need to know." Sarah closed the metal box and carried her phone to the window, looking out at the street where snow continued to fall under the amber glow of streetlights. "I'm listening. We intercepted communications between terrorist cells in 3 different countries," Reynolds continued. "They're planning coordinated attacks using those stolen rifles. Shopping malls, schools, government buildings, soft targets where civilian casualties would be maximized." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years trying to convince herself that her war was over, that she could leave the violence and responsibility behind. But the reality was that her war had simply moved to a different battlefield, one where innocent Americans would pay the price for her desire to remain uninvolved. "When?" she asked. "Intelligence suggests within the next 2 weeks. The weapons have been distributed to cells in London, Paris, and Washington, D.C. Each cell appears to be operating independently, but the timing and target selection suggests coordinated planning." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching her breath fog the surface. 3 cities, countless innocent lives, and the only connection was a cache of weapons that might have been stolen by a man she'd thought was dead. "You still haven't told me why you need me specifically," she said. "The military has plenty of qualified personnel who could track down these weapons. Because Marcus Chun, or whoever is using his identity, has been very careful to avoid detection." by conventional military and intelligence assets. Every time we get close, he disappears. It's like he knows exactly how we operate, what methods we'll use to track him. Of course he would, Sarah thought. If Marcus was alive, he'd been trained by the same instructors, taught the same techniques, and learned the same operational security procedures that every other special operations soldier knew. He would understand American military tactics better than almost anyone. But there's one thing he might not expect, Reynolds continued. The appearance of someone he believed was out of the game permanently. Someone he trusted enough to die. Alongside, the implications were clear. Sarah wouldn't just be hunting a terrorist. She'd be hunting a man who had been her partner, her friend, possibly the person she'd trusted most in the world. If Marcus was alive and involved in weapons trafficking, then either he'd been turned by enemy forces or he'd been playing a deeper game than she'd ever suspected. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "You have until tomorrow night," Reynolds replied. "After that, we move forward with conventional assets and hope for the best." After the call ended, Sarah remained by the window for a long time, watching the snow accumulate on the street below. Her quiet neighborhood looked peaceful in the winter evening. Families gathered around dinner tables, children safe in their beds. Everyone trusting that tomorrow would bring the same security and predictability as today. But Sarah knew how quickly that illusion of safety could shatter. She'd seen what trained killers could do with precision weapons in populated areas. The stolen rifles weren't just military hardware. They were instruments of terror designed to turn everyday locations into killing fields. She opened her laptop and began researching the cities Reynolds had mentioned. London, Paris, Washington, D.C., millions of people going about their daily lives, unaware that someone might be positioning weapons to target them. Shopping centers where families gathered for weekend outings, schools where children learned and played, government buildings where public servants worked to keep society functioning. The tactical part of her mind began analyzing potential targets and attack vectors almost automatically. High-value targets that would maximize media coverage, locations with limited security but high civilian density, symbolic sites that would amplify the psychological impact of the attacks. It was the kind of analysis she'd been trained to perform. And despite 3 years away from active service, the skills remained sharp. By midnight, she'd made her decision. Sarah dressed in dark clothing and drove through the empty streets to the Remington ammunition plant. The night security guard knew her well enough to wave her through the gate without question. She occasionally came in during off hours to catch up on paperwork or prepare for large shipments. But tonight, she wasn't interested in ammunition containers or production schedules. She made her way to the quality control laboratory, where samples of every batch of ammunition were tested for consistency and reliability. The lab contained precise measuring equipment and chemical analysis tools that would serve her current purpose perfectly. Working by the light of a single desk lamp, Sarah carefully extracted one of the rifle rounds from a sample container. Using the lab's microscopic measurement tools, she began documenting the exact specifications of the ammunition: bullet weight, powder charge, cartridge dimensions, and manufacturing markings that would be invisible to casual inspection. If she was going to hunt the people who had stolen military weapons, she needed to understand exactly what they were working with. Every batch of ammunition had unique characteristics that could be traced back to specific production runs and shipping destinations. If she could match the ammunition being used in terrorist attacks to specific stolen shipments, she might be able to track the distribution network backwards to its source. The work took several hours, requiring the kind of methodical precision she'd learned during sniper training. Every measurement had to be perfect, every notation accurate, because the smallest details might prove crucial when lives were at stake. As dawn began to break outside the laboratory windows, Sarah completed her analysis and carefully returned the ammunition samples to their proper containers. She'd gathered enough technical data to potentially identify the stolen weapons if she encountered them in the field. But more importantly, she'd proven to herself that she still possessed the focus and attention to detail that had made her an effective soldier. The drive home took her past Murphy's Diner, where she could see early morning customers already gathering for breakfast. Normal people started another ordinary day, unaware that somewhere in the world, people were planning to disrupt that normalcy with violence and terror. Back in her apartment, Sarah showered and changed into fresh clothes, then sat down at her kitchen table to call Reynolds. The classified documents were still spread across the surface, reminding her of the choice she had to make. "I'm in," she said when he answered on the first ring. "But I have conditions. I'm listening. I work alone. No backup team, no handlers, no military oversight during operations. You give me the intelligence and resources I need, then stay out of my way." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "The stolen weapons are being tracked by multiple intelligence agencies. This isn't a solo mission, Mitchell. There are too many variables, too many potential targets." "Then you'll have to choose," Sarah replied firmly. "Either I do this my way, or you find someone else to chase your ghosts." She could hear Reynolds weighing the options, calculating the risks of sending a lone operator against an unknown enemy versus the potential benefits of using someone with intimate knowledge of the target. Finally he spoke. "Agreed. But you'll carry a satellite communication device and report your location every 12 hours. If you go dark for more than 24 hours, we assume you've been compromised and send in a full tactical team." "Fair enough. When do I leave?" "There's a military transport flight leaving Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at 1800 hours today. You'll be in London by tomorrow morning, local time." Sarah looked around her apartment at the simple life she'd built through 3 years of careful routine and deliberate anonymity. In less than 12 hours, she'd be back in the world of classified missions and deadly consequences, hunting a man who might once have been the person she trusted most in the world. "One more thing," she said. "If I find Marcus Chun, and if he's really involved in this weapons trafficking operation, I handle it my way. No extraction, no capture for interrogation. Some betrayals can't be forgiven." Reynolds' pause was longer this time. "Understood. But remember, Mitchell, until we know for certain what happened in Afghanistan and why those weapons were stolen, Marcus Chen is still officially listed as killed in action, a hero who died serving his country. Heroes don't steal weapons to arm terrorists," Sarah replied. "And dead men don't plan coordinated attacks on civilian targets." After ending the call, Sarah began the methodical process of preparing for deployment. Her military training had emphasized the importance of proper preparation, the right equipment, carefully planned logistics, and thorough intelligence analysis could mean the difference between mission success and becoming another casualty. Statistic. From her closet, she retrieved a duffel bag that had accompanied her through multiple deployments. Inside went clothing suitable for European weather, basic medical supplies, and personal items that would help her blend in as a civilian traveler. Her modified 1911 pistol would have to remain behind. International travel with firearms required. Paperwork and coordination she didn't have time to arrange, but there were other tools of her trade that could pass airport security inspection. A tactical knife disguised as a camping tool, lock-picking equipment that looked like a standard multi-tool, and various electronic devices that appeared to be normal consumer electronics, but had been modified for surveillance and communication. Purposes. As afternoon approached, Sarah took one final look around her apartment. Knowing she might never return to the quiet life she'd built in Ohio, the ammunition plant job had been more than just employment. It had been proof that she could exist in the normal world, that she could be something other than a weapon aimed at America's enemies. But as she locked the door behind her and walked to her truck for the drive to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Sarah realized that perhaps she'd been fooling herself all along. The war had never really ended for her. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to call her back. The military transport touched down at RAF Mildenhull at 0630 hours local time. The gray English morning matching Sarah's mood as she disembarked with a handful of other passengers. Her cover story was simple: freelance security consultant contracted by an American firm to assess vulnerabilities at international business locations. The paperwork Reynolds had provided was thorough enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but she hoped it wouldn't be tested too rigorously. London struck her immediately as a city under subtle siege. Armed police patrolled Heathrow Airport in pairs, their automatic weapons visible but carried with the casual familiarity that suggested this had become routine rather than emergency response. Security cameras tracked every movement through the terminal, and she counted at least 3 plainclothes officers watching passenger flows from strategic positions. The intelligence briefing Reynolds had provided during the flight painted a picture of a city on edge. 3 separate terrorist incidents in the past 6 months had left authorities hyper-vigilant, and the theft of advanced American weaponry had every security service in Europe operating at heightened alert levels. What they didn't know was that the threat might already be inside their borders, positioned and waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah's first destination was a safe house in Camden, a nondescript apartment above a used bookstore that served as a staging area for American intelligence operations. The building's exterior showed decades of London weather and urban wear, but the apartment itself was equipped with communication gear that would have impressed most military installations. Agent Diana Walsh was waiting for her, a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested extensive field experience. She'd been briefed on Sarah's background, though her security clearance was high enough to know details that even Reynolds hadn't shared. "Welcome to London," Walsh said, offering coffee that actually tasted decent for a change. "I understand. You're here hunting ghosts." Sarah studied the tactical maps spread across the apartment's main table. London's street layout, marked with potential target locations and known surveillance camera positions. Red pins indicated areas where unusual activity had been reported: equipment purchases, vehicle rentals, and communication intercepts that might suggest operational planning. "What's the current threat assessment?" Sarah asked. Walsh pulled up digital files on a secure laptop, displaying surveillance photographs and intelligence summaries. 3 separate cells, probably no more than 4 people each. "They've been careful to avoid electronic communications, but we've tracked cash purchases of equipment that could be used for long-range shooting. Tripods marketed as photography equipment, range-finding devices sold as surveying tools, even specialized ammunition purchased through legitimate sporting goods stores." The shopping list was familiar to Sarah. Everything needed to set up precision shooting positions in an urban environment. Whoever was planning these attacks understood the logistical requirements for successful sniper operations. Another piece of evidence pointing toward professional military training. "Any direct sightings of the stolen weapons?" Sarah asked. "Negative. But 3 days ago, Customs intercepted a shipping container from Eastern Europe that contained rifle cases with foam padding cut to match the exact dimensions of the missing weapons. The cases were empty, but residue analysis confirmed they'd recently contained the specific type of rifle stolen from the American shipment." Sarah studied the shipping manifests and customs documentation. The container had arrived from Romania, routed through a logistics company that existed only on paper. Professional smuggling operation with connections to international criminal networks. Exactly the kind of infrastructure that someone like Marcus would need to move weapons across multiple borders. "I need to see the intercept location," Sarah said, "and I want to review any surveillance footage from the port during the week that container arrived." Walsh nodded toward a government sedan parked outside, already arranged. "But first, there's someone you need to meet." The drive through London's morning traffic gave Sarah time to observe the city's security posture. Military vehicles at key intersections, armed response units positioned near government buildings, and everywhere the watchful presence of surveillance. Systems that had turned the ancient city into a modern panopticon. Their destination was a secure facility in Vauxhall, an unremarkable office building that housed one of Britain's most sophisticated intelligence analysis centers. Agent Walsh led her through multiple security checkpoints to a conference room where a single man waited with files spread across a polished table. Inspector James Hartwell, Counter-Terrorism Command. The man introduced himself with the crisp diction of someone accustomed to briefing government officials. I understand you have particular interest in our current security situation. Hartwell was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of tracking people who planned mass casualties as casually as others planned dinner parties. His files contained intelligence that made Reynolds' briefing look incomplete. 4 months ago, we identified unusual activity at 3 separate locations across London. Hartwell began, pulling up street maps marked with colored pins. Wembley Stadium, the British Museum, and Parliament Square. In each case, we detected surveillance activities consistent with target assessment, photography of security arrangements, timing of patrol schedules, identification of sight lines from nearby buildings. Sarah studied the maps, her tactical training automatically analyzing the locations for their operational potential. Wembley could hold 90,000 people during major events. The British Museum drew millions of international visitors annually. Parliament Square represented the symbolic heart of British democracy. Each target offered maximum civilian casualties and global media impact. The surveillance was conducted by individuals who demonstrated professional-level tradecraft, Hartwell continued. They avoided security cameras, used counter-surveillance techniques to detect following agents, and disappeared completely when our teams attempted to establish closer observation. Any physical descriptions? Sarah asked. Hartwell slid 3 photographs across the table, grainy surveillance images captured from long distance. Each showed a figure in dark clothing, face obscured by hats and shadows, but something about their posture and movement patterns triggered recognition in Sarah's mind. The 3rd photograph made her breath catch. A figure climbing stairs near Parliament, captured from behind but showing enough of his profile to reveal a distinctive gait that Sarah remembered from countless patrol missions in Afghanistan. Marcus had favored his left leg after an IED injury, creating a subtle irregularity in his walk that she'd learned to recognize from hundreds of meters away. "This one," she said, pointing to the 3rd image. "When was this taken?" 6 weeks ago, during a period when Parliament was hosting international security conferences. The subject spent approximately 3 hours in the area, systematically photographing sight lines from multiple elevated positions. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Hartwell the surveillance photograph Reynolds had provided, the unclear image from Eastern Europe that might show Marcus directing the weapons theft. Side by side, the similarities in body language and movement were harder to dismiss as coincidence. "I need everything you have on this individual," Sarah said. "Movement patterns, timeline of appearances, any electronic signatures or communication intercepts." Walsh and Hartwell exchanged glances before Hartwell spoke. "There's something else. Yesterday morning, we intercepted encrypted communications between London and cells in Paris and Washington. The encryption was military grade, but our analysts managed to decode fragments of the messages." He handed Sarah a printout of the decrypted communications. Most of the text was still garbled, but several phrases were clear enough to read. "Position confirmed, timeline advanced, and most chilling. Simultaneous execution authorized. The attacks are moving ahead of schedule," Sarah realized. "They're not waiting 2 weeks. Our analysis suggests coordination for this weekend," Hartwell confirmed. Saturday afternoon, when all three cities will have maximum civilian populations in potential target areas. Sarah checked her watch. Thursday morning. Less than 48 hours to identify and neutralize 3 separate terrorist cells across 2 continents. Even with the full resources of multiple intelligence agencies, the timeline was nearly impossible. "I need operational authority to move against these targets," Sarah said. "No committees, no approval processes, no diplomatic considerations. If I identify threats, I need to be able to eliminate them immediately." Walsh looked uncomfortable with the request, but Hartwell nodded understanding. Counter-terrorism operations don't allow for bureaucratic delays. You'll have full support from British authorities, with the understanding that any actions taken are classified at the highest levels. The afternoon was spent reviewing intelligence files and surveillance footage from dozens of sources. Hours of patient analysis, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal the locations where the terrorist cells were preparing their attacks. Sarah's trained eye caught details that others missed: vehicle types favored by military personnel, equipment positioning that suggested sniper training, and movement patterns that revealed professional operational security. By evening, she'd identified 3 potential staging areas across London where the surveillance activities had been concentrated. Abandoned buildings with clear sightlines to the identified targets, recent rental activities by individuals using cash payments and minimal identification, and unusual delivery patterns that could indicate equipment storage. The first location was a converted warehouse in East London, positioned to provide elevated shooting positions toward Wembley Stadium. Building records showed it had been leased 3 months earlier by a shell company with untraceable ownership. Utility records indicated minimal electricity usage except for a brief period 2 weeks ago when power consumption spiked for several hours, possibly when equipment was being tested or calibrated. The second location was an office building near Russell Square, with direct sightlines to the British Museum. Security camera footage from nearby businesses showed a van making multiple nighttime deliveries to the building's service entrance, always driven by individuals who avoided showing their faces to surveillance systems. The third location was the most concerning: a residential flat near Westminster Bridge with perfect positioning for attacks on Parliament Square. The flat had been rented by someone using identification documents that British authorities now suspected were sophisticated forgeries. More troubling, the rental had been secured by someone who demonstrated intimate knowledge of London's property. Rental procedures suggesting either extensive preparation or inside assistance. As night fell over London, Sarah prepared for reconnaissance of the 3 locations. This wasn't the kind of mission that could be conducted through surveillance from a distance. She needed to get close enough to confirm the presence of weapons and identify the number of hostiles at each location. The equipment Walsh provided was military-grade, but civilian in appearance. Night vision optics disguised as photography equipment, communication gear that looked like standard electronics, and a selection of non-lethal weapons that could neutralize targets without alerting nearby civilians to the operation. "Remember," Walsh said as Sarah prepared to leave the safe house, "these are British citizens going about their evening routines in those neighborhoods. Whatever action you take has to be surgical. No collateral damage, no innocent casualties." Sarah understood the constraint, but she also knew that surgical operations required precise intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. If Marcus was indeed alive and coordinating these attacks, he would have taught his team the same counter-surveillance techniques that made American special operations so effective. Getting close enough for accurate assessment would require skills she hadn't used since Afghanistan. The first location proved to be a dead end. The warehouse was empty except for construction debris and showed no signs of recent weapons storage. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the cell had already moved to their final attack position. The second location was more promising. Thermal imaging revealed heat signatures in the building's upper floors, and audio surveillance detected movement. Patterns consistent with multiple individuals maintaining operational security protocols. But something felt wrong about the positioning, too obvious, too easily detected by anyone conducting systematic surveillance. It was the third location near Westminster Bridge that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Parked in the building's underground garage was a vehicle she recognized from surveillance footage, a dark van that had been photographed near all three target locations during the past month. More importantly, thermal imaging revealed the distinctive heat signature of precision. Rifles stored in temperature-controlled cases. As she watched from a concealed position across the street, Sarah saw a figure move past one of the building's windows. Someone checking sight lines toward Parliament Square with the methodical precision of military training. For just a moment, the figure's profile was visible in the window's reflection, and Sarah felt a chill of recognition that went beyond tactical analysis. Marcus Chun was alive. He was in London, and in less than 48 hours he was planning to turn Parliament Square into a killing field. Sarah spent the rest of Thursday night establishing surveillance positions around the Westminster flat, using techniques she'd perfected during urban operations in Fallujah and Mosul. The building was a converted Victorian townhouse split into luxury apartments, the kind of expensive London real estate that attracted international business travelers and wealthy tourists. Perfect cover for someone who needed to blend into the city's transient population. From her position in a 24-hour internet cafe across the street, she had clear sight lines to the building's entrance and most of its windows. The thermal imaging equipment, disguised as a laptop bag, revealed three distinct heat signatures moving through the flat's upper floors, confirming her assessment of a three-person cell. The movement patterns were methodical and professional. Every 2 hours, one figure would move to different windows, spending exactly 10 minutes at each position before moving on. They were conducting systematic surveillance of Parliament Square, timing security patrols, and identifying optimal shooting positions for Saturday's planned attack. At 0300 hours, Sarah observed something that made her blood run cold. One of the figures moved to the window facing Parliament and remained there for nearly 30 minutes, completely still in a prone position. Through her scope, she could make out the distinctive outline of a sniper rifle pointed toward the government buildings across the river. They weren't just planning the attack, they were rehearsing it. By Friday morning, Sarah had identified the daily routine of all three cell members. Two appeared to be younger, possibly in their 20s, with movement patterns that suggested military training but not the refined discipline of special operations veterans. The third figure moved with the controlled precision she remembered from Afghanistan, someone who had learned to make every motion count, to waste no energy on unnecessary movement. Her encrypted satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from Reynolds, Washington and Paris cells identified, moving against targets simultaneously at 1400 GMT Saturday. Confirm London status. Sarah typed her response carefully, aware that electronic communications could be intercepted. Target confirmed. 3 hostiles, advanced positioning, proceeding with neutralization. The reply came within minutes. Negative on solo operation. British tactical team standing by for coordinated assault. Sarah stared at the message, knowing that a conventional tactical response would eliminate any chance of taking Marcus alive and learning the truth about what had happened in Afghanistan. More importantly, if Marcus detected approaching tactical teams, he had the skills to disappear completely, leaving behind a weapon that could still be used against civilian targets. She powered down the satellite phone without responding and began preparing for a different kind of operation. The approach had to be perfect. Marcus would have positioned early warning systems throughout the building, motion sensors, camera feeds, possibly even tripwires that would alert him to approaching threats. But there was one advantage Sarah possessed that no other operator could claim. She knew how Marcus thought. understood his tactical preferences, and could predict his defensive preparations. During their partnership in Afghanistan, they developed a system of communication that didn't rely on radio frequencies or visual signals. A series of specific sounds, tapping patterns, vocal inflections, even breathing rhythms that could convey tactical information without alerting enemy forces to their presence. If Marcus was truly the same person she'd served with, he would remember those signals. Friday afternoon, Sarah positioned herself in the building's underground parking garage, having gained access through a service entrance that wasn't covered by security cameras. The thermal imaging revealed that 2 of the cell members had left the building, probably conducting final reconnaissance of their target area. Only one heat signature remained in the flat, the figure whose movement patterns matched her memories of Marcus. The building's interior was elegant but showed signs of age: creaking floorboards, loose handrails, and doorframes that didn't quite seal properly. Sarah moved through the corridors using techniques learned in urban warfare, placing her feet carefully to avoid sounds that would carry through the old construction. Outside the flat's door, she could hear faint sounds of activity: papers rustling, equipment being handled, and the distinctive metallic sounds of a rifle being disassembled and cleaned. Professional maintenance of weapons before a critical operation. Exactly what she would expect from someone with Marcus's training. Sarah took a breath and used their old signal: 3 soft taps, pause 2 taps, pause 1 tap. A pattern they'd used in Afghanistan to indicate friendly approaching, safe to respond. The sounds inside the flat stopped immediately. For nearly 30 seconds, there was complete silence, as if whoever was inside was processing the significance of a signal that should have been known only to 2 people, one of whom was officially dead. Then, from inside the flat, came the response she'd been hoping and dreading to hear: the correct countersignal, tapped against the wooden doorframe. Marcus was alive, he remembered their codes, and he was acknowledging her presence. "Hello, Sarah," came a voice through the door, slightly muffled but unmistakably familiar. "I was wondering when you'd find me." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the concealed pistol Walsh had provided, even as her mind struggled with the emotional impact of hearing Marcus speak. For 3 years, she'd carried the guilt of his death, believing she'd failed to protect her partner. Now that guilt was being replaced by a different kind of pain. The realization that he'd chosen to let her suffer while he pursued some agenda she couldn't yet understand. "Open the door, Marcus," she said quietly. "We need to talk." "I don't think that's wise," Marcus replied. "You're not here for a reunion. You're here because someone sent you to stop what's happening tomorrow." Sarah positioned herself to the side of the door, knowing that Marcus would have planned for the possibility of forced entry. If he'd learned about explosives during his time away from official service, the door could be rigged to eliminate anyone attempting to breach the flat. "What happened in Afghanistan?" she asked. "The village, the extraction, your death. What really happened that day?" There was a long pause before Marcus answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested years of carrying secrets. "I didn't die that day, Sarah, but the person I was before that mission did." "Explain." "The intelligence we were given was wrong. The Taliban didn't just stumble onto our operation. They were led to us. Someone in our own command structure sold us out, provided them with our exact position and timing." Sarah felt the pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed beginning to fall into place. The ambush that had cost 17 American lives hadn't been the result of operational bad luck or enemy competence. It had been betrayal from within their own forces. "The extraction team that pulled us out," Marcus continued, "they weren't there to rescue us. They were there to clean up loose ends. Make sure nobody survived who could ask uncomfortable questions about how the Taliban knew exactly where to find us." "That's impossible," Sarah said, though even as she spoke, memories from that day were shifting into new patterns. "The extraction Team's reluctance to provide medical care, their insistence on separating her from Marcus during transport, the way her debriefing sessions had focused more on what she might have observed than on tactical lessons learned. "They shot me full of drugs that simulated death," Marcus said. "Slowed my heart rate and breathing enough to fool field medical checks. Then they shipped my body back to the States while I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was in a black site facility being interrogated by people who wanted to know what we discovered about the weapons trafficking operation we'd been sent to disrupt." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Their mission in Afghanistan hadn't been routine counterterrorism. They'd been sent to gather intelligence on a weapons smuggling network that apparently included members of their own military command structure. Someone had decided that Sarah and Marcus knew too much and had arranged for their elimination, disguised as enemy action. "Why didn't you contact me?" Sarah asked. "Why let me think you were dead?" "Because they told me you'd been killed in the same facility where they were holding me," Marcus replied. "It wasn't until 6 months later that I learned you'd survived and been given a medical discharge. By then, I was already committed to a different path." Sarah could hear movement inside the flat, Marcus repositioning himself, probably moving away from the door in case she decided to force entry. She knew she should be calling for backup, coordinating with British authorities to surround the building and prevent his escape. Instead, she found herself trying to understand how the man she'd trusted with her life had ended up planning terrorist attacks against innocent civilians. "So you decided to steal military weapons and arm terrorist cells?" she asked. "That's your solution to military corruption?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "You still don't understand, do you? Those weapons aren't going to terrorists, Sarah. They're going to people who are fighting the same network that tried to kill us in Afghanistan. The intelligence reports say otherwise. London, Paris, Washington. Civilian targets, maximum casualties. The intelligence reports are wrong. Just like they were wrong about our mission in Afghanistan." Marcus's voice carried conviction, but also a hint of something else, uncertainty, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Sarah realized that the conversation had reached a critical point. Either Marcus was telling the truth about fighting some larger conspiracy, or he'd been manipulated into believing a false narrative that justified attacking innocent people. Either way, she needed to see the weapons he'd positioned in the flat and assess the actual threat they posed. "Marcus, I'm coming in," she announced. "If you shoot me, you'll never get the chance to prove you're telling the truth." She heard the sound of a rifle bolt being cycled, Marcus chambering around, but not yet taking aim. A warning that he was prepared to defend himself, but not immediately hostile. Sarah turned the door handle slowly and pushed the door open, just wide enough to see inside. The flat had been transformed into a tactical operations center. Maps covered the walls, showing detailed layouts of government buildings in all 3 target cities. Tables held disassembled rifle components, ammunition organized by type and purpose, and communication equipment that could coordinate operations across multiple continents. But it wasn't the setup for mass casualty attacks. The ammunition was armor-piercing rather than anti-personnel. The targets marked on the maps were specific individuals rather than areas of civilian concentration. And the communication equipment was configured for surgical strikes rather than coordinated terrorism. Marcus stood at the far end of the room, a rifle in his hands but pointed toward the floor. He looked older than Sarah remembered, with new scars on his face and arms that spoke of hard years since Afghanistan. But his eyes held the same intelligence and determination she'd depended on during their partnership. "The people we're targeting," Marcus said quietly, "are the ones who sold us out in Afghanistan. Military officers, intelligence officials, and defense contractors who've been trafficking weapons to hostile forces while American soldiers die from those same weapons." Sarah stepped fully into the flat, keeping her hands visible but ready to draw her concealed weapon if necessary. She could see additional evidence of Marcus's claims, photographs of military personnel with detailed background information, financial records showing suspicious transactions, and communication intercepts that suggested coordination between American officials and foreign weapons dealers. Saturday's operation isn't about terrorism, Marcus continued. It's about justice. We're going to eliminate the people responsible for the deaths of those 17 soldiers in Afghanistan, and hundreds of others who've died because someone decided profit was more important than loyalty. Sarah studied the intelligence materials spread throughout the flat, her analytical mind processing the implications of what Marcus was showing her. If his information was accurate, then the terrorist threat everyone was preparing to counter was actually a targeted assassination campaign against military corruption. But if he was wrong, if he'd been fed false intelligence or had misinterpreted legitimate activities, then tomorrow would still result in the deaths of people who might be innocent. Prove it, she said finally. Show me evidence that can't be falsified or misinterpreted. Because right now, I have to choose between trusting you and protecting civilian lives, and I won't make that choice based on assumptions. Marcus set his rifle against the wall and moved to a laptop computer connected to encrypted communication channels. I can do better than show you evidence, he said. I can show you the people who've been hunting both of us since Afghanistan, and prove that the official version of what happened that day was a lie designed to protect the real criminals. As he began accessing files and communication records, Sarah realized that the next few hours would determine not just the success of Saturday's operation, but whether she could ever trust her own government's version of events again. The quiet life she'd built in Ohio seemed impossibly far away, replaced by the complex reality of a war that had never really ended. It had simply moved into the shadows where former soldiers fought battles that would never appear in official histories. Marcus's fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing encrypted files that required multiple authentication protocols. Sarah watched from across the room, her hand still resting near her concealed weapon, as layers of digital security peeled away to reveal information that had been hidden for years. This is Colonel David Brennan, Marcus said, pulling up a military photograph alongside financial records. He was our commanding officer during the Afghanistan deployment. According to official records, he's a decorated veteran who's currently serving at the Pentagon in weapons procurement. Sarah recognized Brennan immediately, a career officer with an impeccable service record who had personally briefed them before several high-priority missions. She'd never had reason to question his loyalty or competence. According to these banking records, Marcus continued, Brennan has received over $2 million in payments from Konstantin Volkov, a Russian arms dealer who's been selling American weapons to Taliban forces since 2019. The financial documents showed a complex web of transactions routed through offshore accounts and shell companies, but the pattern was clear once Marcus highlighted the relevant transfers. Money flowing from known weapons traffickers to American military officers, perfectly timed to coincide with the theft and resale of U.S. military equipment. Brennan wasn't the only one, Marcus said, pulling up additional files. There's an entire network, officers, contractors, intelligence officials, all profiting from the systematic theft and resale of American weapons to our enemies. Sarah studied the evidence with growing unease. The financial transactions were too detailed and consistent to be fabricated, and many of the names on the list were people she recognized from her own military service. If Marcus's information was accurate, then corruption within the U.S. military was far more extensive than she'd ever imagined. The mission in Afghanistan, Marcus explained. We weren't sent there to disrupt a Taliban weapons cache. We were sent to gather evidence on Volkov's distribution network. Someone in Washington suspected that American weapons were being funneled to enemy forces, and they needed proof. Marcus pulled up classified mission documents that Sarah had never seen before. Detailed intelligence briefings that went far beyond the simple counter-terrorism operation she'd been told they were conducting. According to these files, their real objective had been to photograph specific weapons and document serial numbers that could prove American military equipment was being used against American forces. "We got too close to the truth," Marcus continued. "The photographs we took during that mission would have exposed the entire trafficking network. So Brennan arranged for our elimination, disguised as an enemy ambush." Sarah remembered the strange aspects of their final mission. The unusual timing, the last-minute changes to their operational parameters, and the way their extraction had been delayed until after the Taliban attack began. Details that had seemed like operational bad luck at the time now appeared to be deliberate sabotage. "Show me the evidence we collected," Sarah said. Marcus accessed another encrypted folder, revealing dozens of photographs taken during their final days in Afghanistan. Images of weapons caches containing rifles and ammunition with American serial numbers, documentation of supply routes used to transport stolen equipment, and most damning, photographs of Colonel Brennan meeting with known Taliban intermediaries at a remote location near the Pakistani border. "You took these pictures," Sarah said, recognizing the precise composition and technical quality that Marcus brought to surveillance photography. "We both did. You were covering my position while I documented the meeting between Brennan and the Taliban representatives. That's when they detected our presence and launched the attack that was supposed to kill us both." The memories came flooding back with new context. Sarah remembered providing overwatch while Marcus worked with his camera equipment, but she'd been told he was documenting enemy positions for future airstrikes. The realization that they'd been gathering evidence of treason rather than planning tactical operations changed everything about that day. "The 17 soldiers who died in the ambush," Sarah asked. "Did Brennan sacrifice them to cover up his involvement?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Worse than that. According to communication intercepts I've obtained, Brennan specifically requested that those soldiers be assigned to the operation. They were asking too many questions about missing weapons and suspicious transfer orders. The ambush eliminated witnesses who might have exposed the trafficking network." Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest. 17 American soldiers, people she'd served alongside, had been murdered not by enemy action, but by the betrayal of their own commanding officer. Men and women who'd trusted their leadership and died because someone valued profit over loyalty. "The weapons you stole," Sarah said, "they're going to be used against Brennan and the others involved in the trafficking network." "Not just Brennan," Marcus confirmed. "Tomorrow, teams in 3 cities will simultaneously eliminate key figures in the corruption network. Military officers, defense contractors, and intelligence officials who've been selling American weapons to our enemies for years." Marcus showed her detailed target profiles for each planned assassination. Colonel Brennan would be eliminated while attending a NATO conference in Washington. Arms contractor Michael Sullivan would be targeted during a business meeting in Paris. Intelligence officer Rebecca Hayes would be eliminated while conducting operations in London. "These people aren't innocent civilians," Marcus insisted. "They're traitors who've caused the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers. The legal system can't touch them because they're protected by classification levels and political connections." Sarah studied the target profiles, recognizing several names from her own military service. These were people in positions of significant authority, individuals whose betrayal would have far-reaching consequences for American military operations worldwide. "What about the other team members?" Sarah asked. "The people working with you, do they know the full scope of what they're involved in?" Marcus hesitated before answering, the first sign of uncertainty he'd shown since she'd entered the flat. "They know they're targeting people responsible for American military deaths. They don't know all the details about Afghanistan or the specific evidence we collected. So you've recruited people to commit assassinations based on incomplete information." Sarah observed. What if you're wrong about some of these targets? What if your intelligence has been manipulated the same way ours was in Afghanistan? The question clearly troubled Marcus, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into his expression. For 3 years, he'd been operating on the assumption that his intelligence was accurate and his targets were legitimate. But if the corruption network was sophisticated enough to manipulate official military operations, it was certainly capable of feeding false information to someone seeking revenge. "I've verified everything," Marcus said, but his voice lacked the earlier conviction. Multiple sources cross-referenced intelligence, financial records that can't be falsified. The same way we verified our mission parameters in Afghanistan. Sarah countered. "Marcus, what if someone has been feeding you information designed to turn you into exactly what you've become? A rogue operator targeting people who might actually be innocent." Sarah moved to the laptop and began examining the intelligence files with a fresh perspective. As a trained analyst, she knew that sophisticated disinformation campaigns often included accurate information mixed with false data, making the deception nearly impossible to detect without independent verification. "This financial data," she said, pointing to the banking records that supposedly showed payments to Colonel Brennan. "How did you obtain it?" "Anonymous intelligence source," Marcus admitted. "Someone with access to classified financial databases, who contacted me 6 months after I escaped from the black site facility. Someone whose identity you can't verify, providing information you can't independently confirm, targeting people who happen to be in positions to expose actual corruption if they're innocent," Sarah summarized. "Marcus, what if you've been played?" The possibility that his entire revenge operation might be based on manufactured evidence clearly shook Marcus. He began reviewing the intelligence files with new scrutiny, looking for inconsistencies or signs of manipulation that he might have missed during his initial analysis. "Even if some of this information is false," Marcus said, "we know for certain that we were betrayed in Afghanistan. 17 soldiers died because someone provided intelligence to the Taliban. That much is undeniable." "Agreed," Sarah said. "But targeting potentially innocent people based on questionable intelligence makes us no better than the people who betrayed us. If we're going to seek justice, we need to be absolutely certain we're targeting the right people." Marcus stared at the intelligence materials spread across the table. Years of planning and preparation suddenly called into question by the possibility that he'd been manipulated into becoming a weapon aimed at innocent targets. "There's one way to verify the truth," Sarah said. "The original evidence we collected in Afghanistan, the photographs and documentation that supposedly proves the trafficking network exists. If that evidence is real and supports your intelligence, then we proceed. If it contradicts your information, then we know you've been fed false data." "The evidence was destroyed when they faked my death," Marcus said. "At least that's what I was told." "Maybe not," Sarah replied, pulling out her secure satellite phone. "I'm going to contact Agent Walsh and request access to the classified files from our Afghanistan deployment. If the evidence exists and supports your intelligence, then I'll help you complete the mission. If it contradicts your information, you call off the attacks." Marcus considered the proposal for several minutes, weighing years of planning against the possibility that he'd been deceived by the same forces he was trying to fight. Finally, he nodded agreement. "But we do this carefully," he said. "If Walsh or any other official tries to interfere with the mission based on false pretenses, we proceed as planned. I won't let the people responsible for those 17 deaths escape justice because of bureaucratic manipulation." Sarah activated the satellite phone and began the complex process of accessing classified military archives. As she worked through security protocols and authorization procedures, she reflected on how much had changed since her quiet morning at the ammunition plant just days earlier. Her simple life in Ohio, packing ammunition and avoiding questions about her past, seemed like a different lifetime. Now she was in the heart of London, working with a man she'd thought was dead, trying to prevent either a terrorist attack or the assassination of innocent officials. The peaceful existence she'd built for herself had been an illusion, a temporary escape from a war that had never really ended. The satellite phone connected to a secure server at Langley, and Sarah began navigating through layers of classified archives, searching for the original mission files from Afghanistan. The truth about what had really happened that day, and whether Marcus's targets were guilty or innocent, lay somewhere in those digital records. As she worked, Marcus continued reviewing his intelligence materials, looking for signs of manipulation or deception that might indicate he'd been fed false information. Both of them understood that the next few hours would determine not just the success of Saturday's operation, but whether they could trust any of the information they'd been given about who was responsible for the deaths of their fellow soldiers. Outside the flat's windows, London's evening traffic created a steady background hum that masked the sound of their activities. Somewhere in the city, other members of Marcus's team were making final preparations for operations that would either deliver justice or commit murder, depending on which version of the truth proved to be accurate. The weight of that responsibility, distinguishing between justice and terrorism, between legitimate targets and innocent officials, rested on their ability to verify intelligence that had been compromised from the very beginning. As Sarah continued accessing classified files and Marcus reviewed his operational plans, both of them knew that time was running out to make the right choice. The classified files from Afghanistan took 3 hours to fully download and decrypt, each security layer requiring additional authentication from Sarah's military credentials. As the data streamed onto Marcus's laptop, both of them understood they were accessing information that could either validate years of planning or expose a deception that had manipulated them both. The original mission reports painted a picture dramatically different from what either of them remembered. According to the classified documentation, their deployment to Afghanistan had been part of a larger operation called Meridian Sweep, a joint CIA military intelligence investigation into suspected weapons trafficking that reached the highest levels of military command. "Look at this," Sarah said, highlighting sections of the operational briefing. "We weren't just gathering evidence on Taliban weapons caches. We were specifically investigating reports that American military equipment was being sold to hostile forces by personnel within our own command structure." The mission parameters were far more complex than the simple reconnaissance operation they'd been told they were conducting. According to the classified files, Sarah and Marcus had been selected for the mission, specifically because they were outside the normal chain of command for weapons procurement and had no prior connection to the personnel under investigation. "Photographs we took," Marcus said, cross-referencing the archived mission data with his own intelligence files. "They were supposed to be transmitted directly to a classified server at Langley, bypassing normal military communication channels." Sarah scrolled through the technical specifications for their communication equipment, discovering that their field radios had been modified with encryption protocols that would have made their transmissions undetectable to anyone monitoring standard military frequencies. The level of operational security suggested that their mission commanders had suspected that normal communication channels had been compromised. "Here," Sarah said, finding a section of the files that made her breath catch: emergency extraction protocols. "If we discovered evidence of weapons trafficking involving American personnel, we were supposed to transmit a specific code word that would trigger immediate extraction by a specialized team." Marcus leaned over her shoulder to read the extraction procedures. "But that's not what happened. We were told to maintain radio silence until the scheduled extraction time, and when the attack started, our emergency signals weren't answered." The archived communication logs revealed the truth about their final day in Afghanistan. Sarah and Marcus had successfully documented evidence of American weapons being transferred to Taliban forces, including photographs of Colonel Brennan meeting with known weapons traffickers. But when they attempted to transmit the evidence using the prescribed protocols, their communications had been intercepted and rerouted. Someone was monitoring our transmissions, Sarah realized. They knew exactly what evidence we'd gathered, and when we were planning to transmit it. That's how they were able to coordinate the Taliban attack with such precise timing. The communication intercepts showed that their emergency extraction requests had been received by the classified server at Langley, but had never been forwarded to the tactical response teams responsible for their rescue. Instead, the requests had been buried in bureaucratic channels while Taliban forces moved to their position. The 17 soldiers who died, Marcus said quietly, they were the tactical response team that was supposed to extract us. When our emergency signals were blocked, they launched an unauthorized rescue mission. The truth was more devastating than either of them had imagined. The soldiers who died in the Afghanistan ambush hadn't been random casualties of Marcus and Sarah's compromised mission. They had been attempting to save 2 fellow soldiers whose calls for help had been deliberately ignored by someone within their own command structure. Sergeant First Class Angela Rodriguez, Sarah read from the casualty list, remembering a tough infantry soldier who taught hand-to-hand combat classes at their forward operating base. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Corporal Jennifer Walsh, Private First Class David Kim. She continued reading the names, each one representing someone they'd known personally. Soldiers who died attempting a rescue mission that should never have been necessary if proper extraction protocols had been followed. The evidence we gathered was never destroyed, Marcus said, accessing deeper levels of the classified archive. It's all here, the photographs, the financial records, the communication intercepts proving that American weapons were being sold to Taliban forces. The archived evidence confirmed Marcus's intelligence about the trafficking network, but with crucial differences. Colonel Brennan was indeed involved in weapons trafficking, but he wasn't the only one. The network included personnel at multiple levels of command, from field officers to Pentagon officials, all coordinating to steal and resell American military equipment. But there's something else, Sarah said, finding additional files that had been classified at levels beyond their original security clearance. After we were extracted, military intelligence continued the investigation using the evidence we'd gathered. They arrested 12 people involved in the trafficking network. Marcus stared at the arrest records, dated just 6 months after their mission in Afghanistan. According to the classified files, their evidence had led to the successful prosecution of the weapons trafficking network, including several of the people Marcus had been planning to assassinate. Brennan died in federal prison 8 months ago, Sarah read from the updated personnel files. Arms contractor Michael Sullivan was sentenced to life imprisonment for treason. Intelligence officer Rebecca Hayes was executed by military tribunal for providing classified information to enemy forces. The people Marcus had been planning to kill were already dead, victims of the legal justice system that had used the evidence Sarah and Marcus had gathered in Afghanistan. The trafficking network they'd risked their lives to expose had been dismantled through proper legal channels, not vigilante assassination. Then who's been feeding you false intelligence? Sarah asked. Who wanted you to believe these people were still alive and needed to be eliminated? Marcus accessed the communication logs for his anonymous intelligence source, tracing the digital signatures and routing protocols that had delivered the false information over the past 3 years. The technical analysis revealed sophisticated cyber warfare techniques that suggested state-level resources and capabilities. Russian intelligence, Marcus said as the analysis completed. The same people who were buying American weapons from the trafficking network. They've been manipulating me since I escaped from the Black Site facility. The full scope of the deception became clear as Sarah and Marcus reviewed the communication intercepts and psychological analysis files. After the weapons trafficking network had been dismantled, Russian intelligence had lost a valuable source of American military equipment. Their response had been to turn one of the soldiers responsible for exposing the network into a weapon aimed at innocent American officials. "They told me you were dead to isolate me from anyone who might question my intelligence," Marcus realized. "Then they fed me false information about the trafficking network still being active, targeting people who were already dead or innocent officials who had no connection to the original crimes." Sarah pulled up the current assignments for the officials Marcus had been planning to assassinate. The people his teams were targeting in London, Paris, and Washington were legitimate military and intelligence personnel who were actually working to prevent the kind of weapons trafficking that had killed 17 soldiers in Afghanistan. "Your teams," Sarah said urgently. "We need to contact them before they carry out tomorrow's operations. They're about to assassinate people who are fighting the same corruption we exposed." Marcus was already activating his encrypted communication equipment, sending abort codes to his teams in all 3 cities. But the responses that came back were troubling. 2 of the teams confirmed receipt of the abort order, but the London team had gone dark, their communication equipment showing as offline. "They're already in position," Marcus said, checking the tactical timeline for the London operation. "Final approach to target, all communication equipment disabled to avoid detection." Sarah grabbed her satellite phone and began calling Agent Walsh, knowing that British authorities needed to be warned about the assassination attempt. But even as she dialed, both she and Marcus realized that the London team was beyond recall. They would proceed with their mission unless physically intercepted. "The target is Inspector James Hartwell," Marcus said, reviewing his operational files. "My team believes he's a corrupt intelligence official who's been protecting the weapons trafficking network." Sarah's blood ran cold. Hartwell was the counter-terrorism command officer who'd been helping her track the stolen weapons, one of the people working hardest to prevent terrorist attacks in London. His assassination would eliminate someone actively fighting against the kind of corruption that had led to the deaths in Afghanistan. "Where's the assassination scheduled to take place?" Sarah asked. Marcus pulled up the tactical plan on his laptop. "Hartwell's apartment building in South London. The team was supposed to eliminate him during his evening routine, making it look like a random crime rather than a targeted assassination." Sarah checked her watch. 8:30 p.m. local time. If Hartwell followed his normal schedule, he would be arriving home from work within the next 30 minutes, walking directly into a trap set by people who believed they were serving justice. "We have to stop them," Sarah said, grabbing her equipment and heading for the door. Marcus hesitated for a moment, years of planning and preparation conflicting with the realization that his mission had been built on false premises. Then he grabbed his own gear and followed Sarah out of the flat. The drive through London's evening traffic was a race against time, with Sarah navigating while Marcus used his knowledge of his team's tactics to predict their positioning and approach routes. The assassination team would be professionals, trained in urban warfare and experienced in eliminating targets without leaving evidence. "They'll position a sniper on the building across from Hartwell's apartment," Marcus explained as they drove. "Probably the rooftop or an upper floor window with clear sight lines to his front entrance. Secondary team members will be on the street level to confirm target identification and provide security." Sarah activated her satellite phone and managed to reach Agent Walsh, quickly explaining the situation and requesting immediate tactical support at Hartwell's address. But even with British authorities responding, she knew they would be arriving at the scene at the same time as Hartwell himself. Hartwell's apartment building was located in a quiet residential area, the kind of middle-class neighborhood where people minded their own business and didn't pay attention to unusual activities. Perfect for an assassination that needed to appear random rather than professionally planned. Sarah and Marcus arrived to find Hartwell's government sedan pulling up to the building's entrance. Through her scope, Sarah could see a figure on the rooftop across the street, partially concealed behind an air conditioning unit, but clearly preparing to take a shot. Target acquired, Marcus said, spotting the second team member positioned near the building's entrance. Male, approximately 25, wearing dark civilian clothing and carrying what appears to be a concealed submachine gun. Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Drawing her concealed pistol, she moved to intercept Hartwell before he entered the building, while Marcus positioned himself to neutralize the sniper across the street. "Inspector Hartwell," Sarah called out as he approached the building entrance. "Counter-terrorism emergency. Get down. Now." Hartwell's training kicked in immediately, and he dropped behind his vehicle just as the sniper's bullet shattered the window where his head had been moments earlier. Sarah returned fire toward the rooftop position, forcing the sniper to take cover while Marcus moved through the building to reach the sniper's position. The second assassin emerged from concealment near the building entrance, automatic weapon raised to eliminate both Hartwell and Sarah, but his tactical training hadn't prepared him for the possibility that his targets might be defended by someone with equal or superior military skills. Sarah's shots were precise and deadly, neutralizing the threat before innocent civilians could be caught in crossfire. Across the street, Marcus had reached the sniper's position, using his intimate knowledge of his own team's tactics to approach from an unexpected direction. By the time British tactical teams arrived, the immediate threat had been eliminated and Inspector Hartwell was safe. But the broader implications of the evening's events were just beginning to unfold. "The weapons trafficking network we exposed in Afghanistan," Sarah explained to Hartwell as they waited for the scene to be secured. "Russian intelligence has been using our success against us, manipulating former American soldiers into targeting the people who are actually fighting corruption." The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of the Russian psychological warfare operation, designed to turn American military personnel against their own government by exploiting their legitimate grievances about corruption and betrayal. Marcus's case was just one example of a broader campaign that had been targeting veterans with classified knowledge and specialized skills. "What happens now?" Marcus asked Sarah as they prepared to leave London. "Now you come home," Sarah replied. "The real weapons trafficking network was dismantled 3 years ago using the evidence we gathered. The people responsible for those 17 deaths have faced justice. Your war is over." 6 months later, Sarah returned to Ohio and her job at the Remington ammunition plant. But the quiet life she'd built there had been permanently changed by her experiences in London. She still packed ammunition containers with mechanical precision, but now she understood the full context of where those weapons might be used and by whom. Marcus had accepted a position with a veterans counseling organization, using his experiences to help other former soldiers who'd been targeted by foreign psychological warfare operations. The guilt and anger that had driven him for 3 years had been replaced by a sense of purpose in protecting other veterans from the kind of manipulation he'd endured. The terrorist attacks that everyone had feared never materialized. Instead, 3 separate teams of manipulated American veterans had been intercepted and provided with psychological counseling and legal support. The stolen weapons were recovered and returned to proper military custody, and the Russian intelligence operation was exposed and dismantled on a cold morning in December, exactly 1 year after Commander Reynolds had first walked into the ammunition plant. Sarah received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, the memorial wall at Arlington National Cemetery, showing the names of the 17 soldiers who had died in Afghanistan attempting to rescue her, and Marcus. Below the photograph, in Marcus's careful handwriting, were the words, "Their sacrifice was not in vain. Justice served through proper channels. Thank you for bringing me home." Sarah folded the letter and placed it in her locker next to her workstation. Then she returned to her task of packing ammunition, understanding now that her quiet work was part of a larger system. designed to protect innocent people from those who would use weapons for evil purposes. The war she'd thought was over had indeed ended, not with violence and revenge, but with the triumph of truth over deception and justice over manipulation. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the courage to question what you'd been told and seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As the morning shift began around her, Sarah smiled slightly and continued her work, knowing that somewhere in the world, former soldiers like Marcus were finding their way home from wars that had continued too long in the shadows of their own minds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.